Hello and welcome back to the Keep Right On podcast, and today I'm joined by former Birmingham City supremo, fitness supremo Dave Carolan, who has just left Derby County and kindly agreed to spend some of his time on this Wednesday afternoon talking pre-season with us. Dave, thank you for coming on. How are you?
I'm well, Alex. I'm well rested after what was a tumultuous end to last season, where at Derby we managed to stay up. Last couple of games it was close to the wire, as they say, but an old Birmingham City manager favourite, John Eustace, came in and did a great job of steadying the ship, but also turning the ship around and got us over the line over the last few days. So it was a great year back at Derby County, and looking forward to what comes in the future.
Yeah, all's well that ends well. Dave, pre-season for Birmingham City has started this week. And they're going to go through all the pre-season testing before Chris Davies gets his hands on the players next week. We want to talk through pre-season testing because it's an area I'm particularly interested in, and an area that fans and even myself don't really get much knowledge into. But obviously, someone who's spent almost 3 decades in football in this kind of capacity probably has a pretty good understanding of it. So, pre-season fitness. Talk us through it from a fitness professional's perspective. How does it look in those early days of pre-season?
Yeah, it's a welcome back to all the players when they walk through the doors, and we'll see it across all clubs across the land, where there's going to be some brilliant media from behind the scenes of everybody turning up with their wash bag under one arm and their boots in their hands, and there'll be fist pumps and how are things and embraces. But not long after that, the players are in their kit and they're in the physio room. And the work starts then, really, in terms of the pre-season. And yes, as you say, the first couple of days are normally spent around baselining and benchmarking all of the players. Fitness testing, as we probably used to call it back in the day. And it does span over probably a couple of days now, where on one day you may be doing all of your routine screening from a kind of physical, medical point of view, if you want to call it like that, where the doctors will get their hands on them and they'll do things like scat testing, which will be used for example, concussion testing. When any players have knocks during the season, then they need to have some reference values for the players in terms of those cognition and concussion tests. So we use something called a scat test. That normally takes anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes for the players sat in front of a computer. And they also run through a lot of kind of tests with the doctor as well, where they'll go through a series of questions which will be there to elucidate, their level of cognition. And those same tests will then be referenced to, say, if the player is on the pitch and they've had some kind of incident, then they will be the benchmark and the baseline that the medics will then return to. The doctors will also normally do cardiac testing. So all the players will get screened for cardiac efficiency and function, and making sure everything's healthy. We only have to think back to Fabrice Muamba many years ago, where cardiac screening was not rudimentary at football clubs back then, whereas nowadays probably players are routinely getting tested every year or 2 years. It doesn't have to be every year, but some clubs will insist on doing that. Others will leave it maybe every 2 or even every 3 years. But ideally, we can, where we have the facility to do that, want to repeat that. So that's the doctor. He may also take some blood tests, which will be sent away for routine scanning across all sorts of things. And that will also be dovetailing in with the nutritionist. They might want to be also looking at if we've got any deficiencies in any kind of mineral or vitamin content, and that'll be immediately set to work on by the nutritionist who will be supporting that as well. So that's the doctor taken care of, and some of those results will come back immediately. Others take a few days. The blood tests normally take a few days to come back, and again, we've got reference values for the players. Should players become ill, or we also sometimes see during the season that players can underperform, and they can underperform for a number of reasons, and not all of them are easy to detect. Okay, it's not just as simple a case of he's not fit enough, or he's not playing enough games, or he feels under the weather. It can be for unknown reasons, and we'll come maybe on to that a little bit later. Then the players will pop down the corridor and go and see the physios, and then it's what we call the MSK testing, so musculoskeletal testing, where they'll be poked and prodded by the physios, who will do all sorts of assessments of joints. So there's a number of different tests around each joint that they will perform. So obviously ankles, knees, hips, backs, shoulders, all of those kind of things. Across each of the joints, there are a number of tests. So depending, when you see Pete Shaw perhaps on the pitch with the Blues players, and you can see him do different types of assessments while he's on the grass, Pete will normally have not only a objective mark, so that he will be able to score everybody on the test that he sees when he has the players in literally in his hands, but he'll also have a subjective feel for how joints feel. So has somebody got increased laxity in their joint compared to other players, or even between different joints? So same player but different knees, they can feel different. And we only have to see players who've had ACLs and things like that in the past. So they've had an ACL reconstruction on one knee, but not on the other. They will feel different. And those are great times for Pete to really get his hands on and feel what the player has in terms of movement in the joint, laxity in the joint. So Pete will have a whole range of different tests that he'll be putting the players through, and they'll be marking everything down, and they'll have reference values from the past to see if people have changed. And then for new players, they'll be obviously in a medical, these will be the same type of tests. So when you see players going for medicals, it's the same thing. All of that being done, there'll be a few other things that might be carried out while they're in the in the kind of care of the medical team. So they might do, for example, dental checks. They might have podiatrists doing foot assessments. They may have optometrists looking at eyes. They may look at ears, all sorts of things. You may have some of the other supplementary medics come in as well. So, for example, if they're using osteopaths or chiropractors, they may also appear on those days, again, to get those kind of reference values. So essentially, by the end of that process for the medical team, they've done kind of internal assessments, and they've done all of the kind of external or joint assessments as well.
Yeah, that's extremely detailed, isn't it, I suppose? But we've got to accept that nowadays not every player is the same. Joints are different in each player. So obviously the medical team need to know those kind of different scores, don't they? So they can assess each player and treat each player differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really where your experienced top-end practitioner comes to the fore. And that's why you have someone like, in Blue's case, Pete, in the building, because the level of knowledge that you have with a top practitioner who can make really critical decisions fast but informed under the pressure of a championship game, which is it's great to see Blues back in the championship again, but the pressure goes up. You're asking somebody to make what could be a decision of the season under all of that pressure. And really it all will come back to what was seen in those first few days of the season as the reference values. How are we going to then go ahead and structure an individual program around that player to ensure that the strengths are maintained and anything that's not optimal is being improved? Okay. And there's always a fallacy that everybody has to be in perfect balance all of the time. As humans, we live in a certain amount of imbalance. So one leg will be a little bit stronger than the other leg. You may have an eye difference in terms of your sight, where you favor your left eye over your right eye. And all of this information builds up a picture around the athlete. And the athletes are treated as individuals. Now, when we come to fitness testing and, performances, it's easy to lump everybody into the team because it's obviously a team sport. But us as practitioners, we're going to sit down and look at the individual and see, how do they measure against baselines that we've had for them before? How do they measure against the rest of the group? In some ways, are they improving themselves? Is the group improving? And where do they sit within that group? Which brings us on to fitness testing.
Yeah, before we talk about what happens outdoors in the fitness testing, Chris Davies has mentioned kind of how important it is these days in the modern day player that, they almost have a pre-season, don't they? You see them on their Instagram channels, posting all sorts of sprint videos and, individual coaching drills out with, people in Marbella, Mykonos and so forth. I don't think you're a professional footballer these days if you don't do that. So kind of how important is it that they come back in shape? And have you noticed in your time in the fitness profession that has changed over time, that they come back in better shape now?
Oh, yes. Like if I go back to 1998 and rocking in as the first sports scientist at Norwich City, we had players coming back who were 17.5% body fat, were 10 kilos overweight. Preseason you used to get fit. That was what preseason was for. And you did it over 4 weeks, and the sessions were brutal, and players were using sweat bags underneath their kit because they wanted to just drop weight fast. But the closed season was exactly what players of the past had done, which was you went away for the summer, you ate, you drank, you had a great time, you partied, and then you came back and you got fit again and you played the season. Yes, nowadays it's obviously vastly different. The sums of money involved in kind of your career as a footballer are vastly inflated as to what those players were earning. And of course, there's probably an argument, going back to your first point, that if it's not on Instagram, it's never happened. So you better be posting pictures of you on your training camp with your personal trainer, and that's an industry in itself that's grown up as well, where players are now looking for individual care and attention. They're having their own performance teams around them, be they physios, soft tissue, fitness coaches, psychologists, chefs, nutritionists, whatever it might be. The athlete is now the CEO of themselves, so of course they're going to go away in the summer and do their program. Now, will they do the club's program? Maybe, maybe not. The club can only provide its advice on that side to the player and recommend that they do it. But, old stagers like me probably set reasonably hard close season, from the point of view of we use that period to build capacity. Okay, and building capacity means doing a lot of the work that the players don't normally get exposed to during the season, building a big aerobic base, getting strong, doing all of the things that really allow them to have a bigger capacity to deal with the workload that comes in preseason, because preseason normally ramps up pretty quick, or it used to. But as we know nowadays, that the players are essentially doing a preseason. Is that hugely different from what we would have scheduled 25 years ago? Not really. It's just you can see it all now, and maybe there is a little bit more of an emphasis now on players going with a coach and getting onto grass, or at least grass-like surfaces, and doing some drills. That probably has changed a little bit more in the last 10 years. And maybe some of the players have swung away from not doing that capacity work. I'd argue that, the kind of rise in injuries that we've seen over the last number of years, there's possibly a root in the fact that the players aren't spending as much time doing the less sexy, more boring capacity building, and more time on the Instagram worthy short drills that look like football all the time. Now, there's a balance between the two, and I'd probably recommend that to players. But of course, if you've got somebody who you're paying money to who's advising you, we can do, you're not going to pay somebody a lot of money to tell you to run for 30 minutes. That's whereas if you can get them to do a lot of drills with you, that probably allows you to bridge between a capacity program and building into whatever the coach wants to do in preseason.
Is there ever, because you obviously been inside these football clubs and given players probably detailed plans when they go away for summers, is there a frustration that they then, in some cases you just mentioned, probably will largely ignore that plan and go and work with their own individual coach and probably do something which isn't necessarily specific to what you've told them to do?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, they are essentially going to be weighed and measured when we fitness test them. So, if you choose to do method A, B, C, or D, you'll be weighed and measured on that. Probably what we've started to do, increasingly is get the players to provide evidence of what they're doing. And ultimately, they will be accountable for whatever state of fitness that they turn up in, So whether you get them to record it on Strava or a different kind of method of recording, we gave players this year at Derby, they had some GPS units. Lots of clubs do that. You can actually take the GPS away with them now, because that allows us to build a kind of 24/7, 365 picture of what the player is doing as much as possible. Now, we also want the players to have a break, and we also feel it's more important now that they get a period away from the club actually being in their ear all the time. They also need to have that mental break as well. But in terms of frustration, I mean, it won't be me on the treadmill having to, produce the blood and show what level of fitness and my level of physiology. The player will. If he's chosen to go with somebody who's given him a lot of football drills, they may not get the best level of, kind of test on that kind of assessment, but they may be better suited then to going into the football work. So there's two things here. There's one, which is that we're measuring, call it physiological fitness. And then there's when they go onto the pitch where football fitness is going to be more to the fore, where it's the actions that they do as a footballer, which probably will be closer to determining whether they're ready for football. But I think there's always that balance between we want a high-performing footballer and we also want a robust athlete who can go through the demands of a full season and not keep breaking down. And those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. They can actually dovetail really well together.
We talked about inside the building, the medical side of things. What happens when the players go outside the building onto the grass for their first fitness test in that field?
Well, coming back to what I just spoke about there, physiology is one of the things that we're seeing less probably apparent in the game. Now, if I go back to when I joined Blues first, my first day was out on the grass at Wast Hills, and I've got actually more staff than players watching the session, and we had a healthy amount of players. I did feel like I was essentially being judged myself that day, as to how I delivered the session, because I can remember Gary Rowett and all his staff and all the medical staff, and I think we even had the security staff. People were bussed in from St Andrews to come and watch the first yo-yo test. But yeah, we were on grass. We were doing a yo-yo test, which was kind of at that stage one of the tests that we used to use. Most people will know it as the bleep test. So even back then, in 2015, it was still a good test for batch testing players. But in terms of how accurate some of those tests can be, it's easy to manipulate. It's easy to manipulate a test where it's either time-based or distance-based, because you can decide whether you want to run hard or not run hard. If you want to have a lower time at the start and then 5 weeks later, if you're going to be retested, you just want to run a little bit quicker and show, look, I've improved in preseason. Wasn't our program great? You can manipulate the test. My preference over the years is more physiology. So before they'd head out onto the grass and do a fitness test, that we actually do a lactate test, which they might do indoors on a treadmill where we're sampling blood. You've seen it in the past that we used to do it at Wast Hills, and I think then in more recent years the club went down, I think, to Coventry University, and might even use Birmingham City Uni as well to do more deeper physiological work, because you can't cheat your own blood. Okay, if your blood's telling us you're fatigued, you're fatigued. If your blood's telling us you could have worked harder, guess what? You could have worked harder. And they're really, really good reference values for us to then be able to determine, say, a heart rate specific intensity, that when we see players in a red zone from a cardiac point of view, we're able to reference that. Well, we know why that is. We know what's causing that, be it the physiological load or the physical load of a session. Now, back out in the grass, different tests in different ways are going to give us other insights around the players rather than just their fitness. It will also tell us about their motivation and maybe around their application and their attitude to some of this stuff. So there's nothing like sitting on a let's call it back in the day a 3,000 meter test. It's a distance run. How quickly can you do it? And normally off the lactate test, we'd be able to predict who would win the 3,000 meter or a 1,500 or something like that, and be pretty accurate with it. But then you've also got the unknowns, which are motivation and application attitude, that we see that some players will go beyond what they're actually in some ways capable of because they know they want to win. It's a different type of challenge. So we can take them out onto the grass, do some of those runs, and we've seen over the years that some players will far outperform what is their physiological test because they've got motivation. So that's a different one. And then we'll do things like perhaps speed testing, we'll do agility testing, we'll do what we call a phosphate decrement test. It's a really fancy name for repeated sprints. And then back in the gym, we will do a whole load of other tests to test muscle strength and balance and function. So you'll see the players squeezing things, pushing things. You'll see players pulling things. So if you imagine all of those kind of tests, again, they're just building this whole 360 for us around all of the different types of things around aerobic function, anaerobic function, speed, endurance, muscle strength, muscle power, jumping ability. You can see here we're building a big picture.
This must be quite a competitive couple of days, mustn't it? I bet players really do get on board with it, or the modern day players definitely.
It depends on the test. You know, if you know it's a strong test for you, you're probably going to give it a little bit more. But most of these tests are maximal tests on these first 2 days. The players know that they're going to have to go to top end. Now, with something like speed, we'd normally not do a sprint test in the first couple of days because the players generally haven't been sprinting. So you may not see sprinting done in any of the videos if the club even release some of this footage. You may not see any sprinting because we'll leave that till potentially the second week of preseason when the players have had a little bit more time on their feet and the muscles and everything are moving even better than they were. Then we might start to introduce some speed testing.
One thing I wanted to ask, and you might not have a name in mind, but when you know in your time at Blues, was there any player who particularly excelled in pre-season testing that was just exceptional at the tests and was a good athlete?
I mean, there were many good athletes, and what you find is, unsurprisingly to most fans or listeners, is that different players excel in different ways. Your centre midfielders tend not to be too fast, but they tend to have really good endurance. Yeah. Where you'll have a centre forward in some cases that may not have fantastic endurance, but they might actually be really quick. So what you tend to do is you have positional profiles that you probably would expect. So where you would look at their profile and think, this is the general makeup of a midfielder. Are they hitting the numbers I would expect for that position? And how can I then support them to be a little bit better in other ways? And it's the same for every one of the other positions. Now, the thing that we also have to add into that is that head coaches and a game model for the club also influence what the expectation is going to be from that player if they're on the pitch. So if you're going to be playing, counter-attacking football with wing backs who are going to be bombing up and down the wing all game, they're going to have phenomenal endurance, and they're going to have really good powers of recovery from high energy or high intensity bursts of activity. So they would certainly be then weighted into their profile as to what we expect from those players.
Something I've noticed in the pre-seasons I covered Blues, how important the fitness coach relationship is with the manager. I remember out in Spain a couple of years ago, Sean Rush, who was fitness coach at the time, was absolutely going ballistic that Manny Langello and Janino Bacuna were doing some ball striking at the end of a 11-a-side game because they'd done too much during that particular day. How important is that relationship? And this time around it'd be Chris Davies as manager, that he listens to the fitness coach and they kind of dictate on certain elements, or does it always come down to the manager and he chooses whether they do extra little bits?
Yeah, it's a really good question. That relationship is very important, as you would imagine, and especially so in this this period of the season, because this is when, as such, we earn our money. With the work that's been done in close season, we advise the players and we hope that they do the work. Once they're in the door, it's how quickly can you get the information together? How quickly can you make a plan in terms of what we need to do with each of the individuals? And then it's dovetailing that with whatever the head coach's philosophy is around how he wants to train and how he wants to prepare for games, and how he then wants to take that game model and express that through training and into the matches. Now, I know Rushy well, so I wouldn't have liked to be some of those players receiving the wrath of his tongue at the end of that session. But a top performer, Sean, so he would have been doing that for the benefit of the players. He's not doing that to essentially be a sergeant major or anything like that. That's him trying to protect the players from themselves, because we're trying to load manage across multiple weeks. We're not necessarily looking at today's session in complete isolation. Of course, we have expectations. We're going to be referencing values that we would have expected and what we actually saw, and then trying to project that to what's to come. So if we've got double days or we've got multiple sessions lined up across a week, we want to make sure that all of the pieces are put together in the right order, and that players or even coaches doing additional things that we hadn't planned for have knock-on effects. So yes, the players might think, I'm only going to do an extra 5 minutes of shooting, but in the extra 5 minutes of shooting, they then do an extra 20, 25 ball strikes of high velocity that we didn't expect on the end of a top intensity session, could just put us over the edge where players pick up injuries. So, I think Sean would have been trying to look after the players there rather than trying to just be, a spoil sport and not let them have fun.
Yeah, you touched on it there, but double sessions, that's the thing that happens a lot at this time of year to get players up to speed. Can you just give us an idea of what that does to the body and the precautions that will need to be taken to ensure players get through it unscathed?
Yeah, I mean, double sessions, triple sessions, it depends how you're counting them. Some people will look at, a gym session is separate to a conditioning session in the afternoon. Some people will say that's just an afternoon session, so I think it always comes down to your method of counting, so but generally speaking, there's going to be a morning and an afternoon session. It depends, again, I'm going to use that word a lot, of how you want to balance your week. Let's say you're going to do six days out of 7 where you're going to be giving the players some form of sessions. Do you choose to go double, and then a single day and then repeat that? Or do you go for a double day, single day, double day, single day? You're going to get the pattern. So that really comes down to your philosophy as a head coach, and also what the head of performance, director of performance, whatever title you choose to use, and the medical staff also think is the best way of us doing the work that we need to do. Now, we always try and, where possible, build most of the fitness work into the football if we can. We're not in the business necessarily of thinking that we have to do all of the fitness work isolated on the side of the pitch or in an afternoon session where the players just stick the trainers on. That was the case maybe 25 years ago. And I'm not saying that they are necessarily the wrong methods to use nowadays. But we've just got better at being able to prescribe the work that we want to do within football. And coaches understand that now, and we try and understand their side a little bit more. And if we can dovetail things together, that mean that football and fitness are integrated rather than isolated, that's the best thing. But not everything can be done integrated. We do need to do some work in an isolated fashion. And I think it's the good work that we do as in the performance departments, working with the others, to select what is the right tool to get us the right outcome. Is it that we take the players away from the balls onto the grass on an afternoon or on a morning or later on in the day if you're on a camp where it's very hot? We have to choose the right time, the right methodology to do the work that we need to do, that we think is going to get us the most bang for our buck, because we only have a limited amount of sessions. So how do we maximize those? Can we also add some additional football stuff into an afternoon session, for example, which is being determined as being a fitness session, but we might be able to do a little bit of technical football work in there as well. So it might reinforce work that the coaches want to do and messages that they want to get across from the kind of game model or the tactical side, but it's done in a kind of low intensity or low impact way, because we're also then going to do some additional fitness work.
And just lastly, you have touched on it a couple of times in this conversation. The term "in the red" gets banded around a lot in football. You know, for example, if the star striker doesn't play on a Saturday, the manager might sometimes say afterwards he was in the red, so we couldn't risk him today. I guess that the information has all been kind of, taken from their preseason tests first and foremost. But can you just kind of explain how it all works? You know, how you know that a player is in the red and can't do a certain training session on that particular day, or can't play 60 minutes in that particular match?
Yeah, I mean, even as a sports scientist, it's not a perfect science. So that what we're looking at here is cause and effect. So we plan a training session, we deliver the training session, and then we have to look at what the response is. And not everybody responds in the same way to the same sessions. So even if a player comes in with a certain profile and we've assessed them and we think they can do all the work, when the rubber meets the road, it might be a different reaction from certain players. You know, the demands of the training session suddenly just catch somebody out a little bit too much. And even with all of the best technologies that we use, even with all of the years of insights and experience, we can still find that some players just can become a little bit overcooked. Now, that might be because even though they went away in that close season and did all that work, they didn't do enough of the right stuff. And that just has a reaction where, for example, if you've got a big aerobic base, you can recover better. If players have ignored doing aerobic work in favor of doing football fitness, that might mean that when they start doing this work, they don't recover as well. And that's when they get sore, and that's when they become risky. And the red zone has kind of got many meanings over the years. Originally, that's what we called a lactate threshold. Nicely, Sam Allardyce spun it around when he was at Bolton, and it became red zone for heart rate, which was the same thing, but it was just simplified. It didn't sound sciencey, it was just a red zone. And now it's become that kind of zone where, in what we call the acute chronic workload ratio, yes, run off to Google and all search that. It's essentially a ratio between the work that we're doing at this exact moment and the work that's been going on maybe for 3 or 4 weeks. And that became, over the last number of years, a kind of term that was used when somebody was now in a risky zone towards picking up a soft tissue injury. Now, a lot of that work has been debunked over the years, but the phrase has still remained, which is, we got a player who's basically at risk from potential injury. The workload has potentially been a little bit too much for them. We actually need to take them into a period now of them deloading a little bit or doing more appropriate work in a different location. So yes, it's always frustrating when you get to one of your first preseason friendlies. The fans turn up in droves. They want to see the new signings playing, to see what they're about, because they will have seen the signing. They might have only caught a few glimpses of training ground footage, but they want to see them in person, but then they're not playing. They're sat there in a tracksuit, or, they're signing autographs, because it's been determined that there's probably more risk than reward of the player going into the game. So that's generally what they'll mean by the red zone. It's probably pertinent that you don't put players into risky situations if you can avoid it. But there is always a trade-off, because for every one of those games that they potentially miss is an opportunity for them to gain a different type of fitness, which all players will be desperate to get as quick as possible. Managers will talk about, which is match fitness. And you can do all of the training that you want, but once you start to go into a match environment, the intensities are different. The bouts of continual play are different. And that's when the good old phrases like getting minutes in the legs or in the bank. Choose whichever one is your appropriate poison there. But essentially, that's where the manager and the players and everybody wants to get minutes into the legs so that the players can build up that robustness, build up that match fitness. So when it comes to the start of the season, they are as fit as they can be for then. But we also know that then over the next kind of 6 weeks in the first 6 or 8 games, that's when peak fitness will then be determined, because it's that period of the early part of the season, which essentially is your extension of your preseason into your early season, where the players will then reach peak fitness.
Brilliant. We're a couple of weeks away from minutes in the legs. That was a fascinating insight into the pre-season testing phase and the early weeks of pre-season, though, Dave. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please do subscribe, hit like, give us a comment, and it's a big keep right on.